that is the world-famous statue of the Little Mermaid in Copenhagen, Denmark. It was created by an artist named Edvard Eriksen, and it's been sitting here since 1913, except for a small trip to the World Expo in Shanghai in 2010. Now, with this statue being here in Copenhagen, and with Christian Andersen being from Denmark, it would make sense to assume that the story of the Little Mermaid takes place in Denmark. But it actually doesn't. Most people probably know that the story of the Little Mermaid is a fairy tale written by Danish author Christian Andersen. It is probably one of his most famous stories, and for good reasons. It's a beautiful story about longing and loss, and it's been spellbinding audiences for almost 2 centuries. These days, though, the story is inextricably linked with the wonderful animated film adaptation from Disney. When most people hear the words The Little Mermaid, they most likely picture the red-headed Ariel from the Disney film. And who can blame them? It is one of Disney's best films. It's fun, it's full of amazing songs, and it's got a great villain. The problem, however, with the story being so closely associated with the movie is that many people start to assume things about the story and, in the worst cases, use those assumptions to justify their racism. So today we're going to be dismantling some of those assumptions, starting with what the story is even about. In its most stripped down version, The Little Mermaid is about a mermaid, the youngest daughter of the Sea King, who longs to go to the surface and thus makes a deal with the Sea Witch where she gives up her beautiful voice in order to get a pair of legs. But there is a big difference between the fairy tale and the animated film as to why. In both versions, the mermaid is fascinated by the human world above, and she falls in love with a prince after having saved him from drowning. However, the reason she makes the trade with the Sea Witch in the fairy tale isn't just because she wants to be with the prince. It's actually because she needs him in order to get a soul. You see, in the story we're told that while merfolk can live to be 300 years old, when they die, they simply become foam on the water. That's it. Done. The humans, though, they don't get to live as long, but when they die, their eternal soul gets to float on up to a new, even more wonderful place that the merfolk can never see. The Little Mermaid is fascinated by this concept of the eternal soul, and she wants a chance to be able to live on forever, but she's told by her grandmother that the only way for her to gain a soul is for a human to love her more than anything else. The human then needs to marry her, and only then would their soul flow over into her. They would then have created a soul for her while still retaining their own. So that is her mission when she goes to the Sea Witch. She does need to get the prince to fall in love with her, but mostly because that's what she needs in order to become truly human. The Disney version is not that far off from this, but her motivations are just simplified slightly. But this leads us to the next difference, which is that the fairy tale doesn't have a villain. It's hard to imagine Disney's The Little Mermaid without Ursula. She is probably one of the greatest Disney villains ever, and the movie simply wouldn't have been the same without her. But that character actually plays a lot smaller role in the original fairy tale. I mentioned before that there is a sea witch in the fairy tale as well, but she isn't really an antagonist. Of course, the mermaid does have to pay her in order to get her legs, and that whole transaction is actually way more gruesome in the fairy tale. In the film, we see Ariel give up her voice in exchange for 3 days on land. She then has to convince the prince to give her a true love's kiss within those 3 days, or she'll turn back into a mermaid and belong to Ursula. In the fairy tale, the sea witch warns the Little Mermaid. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. "It is very stupid of you, but you shall have your way,
and it will bring you to sorrow, my pretty princess. She then goes on to explain that she can make her a potion that will turn her tail into a pair of legs. However, that process will feel as if she was being carved in two by a sword. And furthermore, whenever she takes a step, it will feel as if she's stepping on sharp knives. The fairy tale does give her a bit more time to get the prince to want to marry her. She just has to do it before he marries someone else. Though if he does, she will die and turn to foam on the water. The mermaid agrees to all of this, and as payment, the sea witch wants the best thing the mermaid owns, and that is her voice.
My voice?
But instead of magicking the voice out of her and keeping it in a pretty little necklace, the witch straight up cuts out her tongue. So yeah, it's a bit more graphic and hurtful in the fairy tale, but that is basically all we hear about the witch in that story. She is mentioned again near the end of the story when the mermaid's sisters try to save her, but she's not really trying to cheat the mermaid or foil her plans like we see Ursula do. Speaking of the ending though, that is the next thing we need to talk about. I think when people talk about a story being Disney-fied, it's probably because of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Pocahontas, and The Little Mermaid. All of these stories have a significantly more palatable and some might say happier ending than their respective source materials. You might have heard that in Christian Andersen's version of The Little Mermaid, the story actually ends with the mermaid dying. And that is partially true. After the mermaid gets on land, she has to convince the prince to marry her. But while the prince is fascinated by her and he does really like her, it's more as a sister. He never really falls in love with her. He simply just loves someone else. You see, after the mermaid saves the prince from the shipwreck, she takes him to the shore and leaves him by a convent. A young woman finds him and, together with the rest of the nuns, she nurses him back to health. This is the girl that the prince falls in love with and whom he keeps thinking about. Of course, the prince can't really marry a nun, but it turns out that she actually isn't a nun, but a princess from a neighboring kingdom who was just being educated at the convent, and the prince is able to marry her after all. The Little Mermaid attends the prince's wedding, and she even carries the princess's train as she walks down the aisle, knowing that because the prince is marrying someone else, the next morning she will die. The wedding party then boards a ship, and in the night, after the prince and his new wife retire, the Little Mermaid walks the deck, waiting for the sun to rise and her life to end. As she looks out over the water, her sisters suddenly appear. In an effort to try to save her, they've traded their beautiful hair to the sea witch, who has in turn provided them with a knife. If the Little Mermaid wants to live, she has to take that knife and plunge it into the heart of the prince before dawn. If she does so, she will once again become a mermaid and get to return to the ocean. But the Little Mermaid won't do it. She won't kill the prince. She throws the knife into the waves and dives in after it, sacrificing her own life for the prince's happiness. So, she dies, right? Well, no. After throwing herself overboard, the mermaid suddenly feels herself floating upward, and all around her she sees these transparent, beautiful beings, the daughters of the air. They tell her that because of her sacrifice, she has become one of them, and as a daughter of the air, she now has a chance to create an immortal soul for herself. If she spends 300 years flying all over the world, helping people in need and doing good, she may finally obtain a soul and float into the kingdom of heaven. Mind you, this story was written in 1837, so the Little Mermaid might still be flying about today. But the point is, she doesn't just die. She is given hope. And that is how the story ends. This is, of course, a more complex way of ending the story, and it's definitely kind of bittersweet. So I don't blame Disney for simplifying the story and giving the mermaid a happy ending. But I think it's time we circle back to where we started. Like I said in the opening of this video, many people might assume that since Hans Christian Andersen is Danish and since you can actually go see the statue in Copenhagen, that means the story is set in Denmark. This, however, is false. And while it's not really a problem if people don't know where this fairy tale takes place, it does become a problem when people use this false assumption as a base for racism. Let me take you back to the year 2023. Disney has decided to remake The Little Mermaid in live action. Why? Money. In the titular role as Ariel, the Little Mermaid, they cast the American actress Halle Bailey. And immediately, people all over the internet had a lot of feelings. To be fair, there were a lot of people who were really excited about Bailey's casting, myself included. Once the trailers came out, I felt it was clear that she really embodied the personality of Ariel, and the videos of little girls watching the trailers and seeing a person who looked like them playing this iconic role was just the most heartwarming thing ever. However, there were also people who felt very differently. I saw this in the comments of my own videos about the film. Some people really took an issue with the fact that Halle Bailey is a black woman. Some people had a problem with her not looking exactly like the animated version, which is a bad take because no one is ever gonna look exactly like a cartoon character, and shouldn't it be more important that they're good at acting and match the personality of the character? Also, The Little Mermaid is a literal fish out of water story. Having the character be played by a person of color actually makes so much sense thematically. Then there were people complaining that it was unrealistic that the mermaid would have dark skin because she lives underwater where she isn't exposed to the sun. And this might be the stupidest argument. You might not know this, but mermaids aren't actually real. They're completely made up. The Little Mermaid is a fairy tale creature. And I've said this before, but who gives a shit what color the top half of her is when the bottom half is a fish? Now, some people would go back and use the original fairy tale as a basis for their argument, saying that it is a Danish fairy tale and Halle Bailey doesn't look like someone from Denmark. As a Danish person myself, I can say that if we ignore the fact that there obviously are people of color in Denmark, the majority of Danes do look about as pale as myself. But that really doesn't make sense as an argument. First off, even if the fairy tale took place in Denmark, the mermaid definitely doesn't come from Denmark. You actually don't even have to read that much of the story to get to this fact, because it's the literal first line of the story. Far out in the ocean. That's where the Sea King and his daughters live. Second, even when she gets on land, the fairy tale doesn't describe anything that looks like Denmark. When the Little Mermaid saves the prince, she leaves him outside the convent on a beach with fine white sand. Near that beach, there's a garden with orange and lemon trees, and the entrance to the building is flanked by palm trees. Palm trees and oranges are not something you would associate with the Scandinavian climate. The way it's described in the story is more like something you'd expect from the Mediterranean countries like Spain, Italy, southern France, or Greece. And when she gets to the prince's castle, it's described as being made of marble and bright yellow stone that could be presumed to be some kind of sandstone. Now, while most castles in Denmark are typically made of red bricks, there are some that are made of these types of stones, like for instance, Kronborg, the castle best known as being Hamlet's castle. And that castle is right next to the ocean, but even that doesn't really match the further description of having golden roofs and pillars surrounding the castle. Again, the way the castle is described also sounds more like something you'd find in a Mediterranean country. And this makes sense. Hans Christian Andersen was known to love to travel, and he was specifically very fond of a seaside town called Sestri Levante in Italy, which actually still today hosts an annual Andersen festival. I think it's very likely that the inspiration for the Princess Castle and some of the other locations in The Little Mermaid came from Andersen's travels to Italy and other Mediterranean countries. So with that, I think it's pretty safe to say that the fairy tale doesn't take place in Denmark. But what about the movie? Disney could have chosen to set the story in Denmark as a nod to the home country of the story's creator. But still, I don't think so. If you look at both the cliffs around the castle and the types of animals that show up throughout the film, it's really not something you'd see in Denmark. And if we look at the remake, while they never state where exactly it takes place, Eric mentions a couple of different countries he's been to, most of which are in Middle and South America, which would suggest that it's probably around there somewhere it takes place, though most of the exteriors were shot in Sardinia in Italy. But neither of those, as you might have noticed, are Denmark. So let's just say this once and for all. The Little Mermaid does not take place in Denmark, and thus she does not have to look like a person from Denmark. Now, you could say that what you really want is an adaptation of The Little Mermaid that is 100% faithful to the fairy tale, in which she is described as having skin as clear and delicate as a rose petal. But then that wouldn't be Disney's The Little Mermaid, would it? We already discussed how they changed a bunch of things for the movie, so don't pretend like accuracy to the source material is suddenly extremely important. And don't use the fairy tale as an argument for why Halle Bailey shouldn't have been Ariel. But with that, I think we actually got through everything. Now you know all there is to know about The Little Mermaid. Well, maybe not, but perhaps you learned a thing or two, and that's pretty good too. Let me know down in the comments if there are any other fairy tales or Disney films you'd like me to take a closer look at. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and feel free to subscribe to the channel if you want more videos from me. But with that, that's pretty much all I had for you today. My name is Martin Reis. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and so long.